You ever try fixing the same problem over and over again, thinking it's just bad luck, until you realize the land itself is working against you? That was the barn door. We were out on a stretch of high desert land that didn't look like much to anyone passing through. Just dry grass, scattered sage, and a wind that never really settled. But to us, it was something we had been trying to make work for near a year. And every small failure felt bigger than it should have, because there wasn't much else out there to take your attention. Amy had been the one who pushed for the place, saying the soil wasn't as dead as it looked, and that with enough patience we could turn it into something steady, something that could hold cattle without breaking us in the process. And I believed her, because she wasn't the kind of person to chase a bad idea without seeing it all the way through first. The barn had already been there when we arrived, though calling it a barn felt generous, because most of it had been sun-warped wood and a sagging frame that looked like it had been leaning for years before we ever laid eyes on it. But it was something to start with, and out there, that counted for more than comfort. The first dory hung lasted 3 months at the time. We figured that wasn't too bad, considering the heat, the dryness, and the way the wind carried dust. That felt more like sandpaper than anything else. But by the end of that 3rd month, the wood had started to soften in places it shouldn't have. Dark patches creeping in along the lower boards. And when I pressed my thumb into it one morning, it gave just enough to tell me it wasn't going to hold much longer. Amy didn't say much when we pulled it down, but I could tell it bothered her, because she had been the one who sealed it, coated it in oil, and made sure every edge was covered. And still, it had started to rot from the inside out, like something had found its way in despite all that effort. The second door didn't even make it 2 months. That one we tried treating heavier, soaking it in oil until the wood drank up as much as it could, leaving it to sit in the shade before we mounted it. And for a while it seemed like it might hold better, the surface staying firm and the grain looking tighter than before. But then the same thing started again, slow at first and then all at once, with dark spreading veins that weakened the boards until they cracked under their own weight. By the 3rd time we replaced it, frustration had started to settle in deeper than either of us wanted to admit, because it wasn't just the work. It was the fact that nothing else on the barn was failing the same way. The beams were dry but solid, the posts still holding, and yet the door, the one thing we handled the most, kept breaking down like it was being singled out. You ever seen anything like this? I asked one evening as we leaned the 3rd ruined door against the side of the barn, the sun dropping low and painting everything in that dusty orange light that made the whole place feel older than it was. Amy shook her head slowly, brushing her hands off against her jeans. "Not this fast," she said, her voice thoughtful but edged with irritation. "Wood shouldn't go like that unless something's eating it." "There ain't anything out here to eat it," I said, glancing out across the dry land where even the insects seemed scarce most days. "That's what doesn't make sense," she replied, looking back at the door like it had done something personally. "We put up a 4th one anyway, because there wasn't much else to do. And for a while we stopped talking about it, like it was just one of those things you deal with when you're trying to hold on to land that doesn't really want you there. But it kept happening. Doorway hung lasted less than the one before, and by the time the 4th started to show the same dark creeping signs along the bottom edge, I remember standing there with my hand resting against it and feeling something close to anger, because it didn't feel natural anymore. It felt like we were missing something obvious. It was Amy who noticed the old road first, not really a road anymore, just a faint line cutting across the land, barely visible unless you knew what to look for. But it led off toward a cluster of low structures sitting far enough away that we hadn't bothered checking them before. "You see that?" she said one morning, pointing out past the fence line as the light came up slow and pale over the desert. followed her gaze and squinted until the shapes came into view. Small and worn, like they had been left behind a long time ago. Yeah, I said. Looks like something's still standing out there. She nodded, already thinking ahead the way she always did. Might be worth a look. If someone made it work out here before, they had to know something we don't. I didn't argue, because by then I was ready for any answer. That meant we wouldn't be building another door in a month's time. So we saddled up late that afternoon and followed that old line across the dry ground. The wind pushing steady at our backs and the sky stretching wide and empty above us. And the closer we got, the more those structures started to take shape as something that had once been lived in. Even if it had been a long time since anyone called it home, most of it had fallen apart, roofs gone, walls collapsed, wood bleached gray by years of sun and neglect. But there was one thing that stood out the moment we rode into what used to be a yard, a door, still hanging, still whole, and painted a deep, heavy red that looked almost black in the fading light. Amy slowed her horse beside me, her eyes fixed on it the same way mine were, and for a long moment neither of us said anything. Because after everything we had been dealing with, seeing the door still standing out there felt like more than coincidence. That one's older than ours ever were, she said quietly. I nodded, already swinging down from the saddle and walking toward it, feeling that same pull I had felt the first time one of our doors started to fail. Only this time it came with something else underneath it. Something that felt a lot like the beginning of an answer. At the time, I figured it was just better craftsmanship, maybe stronger wood or thicker boards. But standing there in front of that red painted surface, with the wind brushing dust across my boots and the smell of dry earth hanging in the air, I had the distinct feeling that whatever had kept that door standing all those years wasn't something we had tried yet, and we were about to learn it from someone who had known it a long time before we ever set foot out there. We didn't expect to find anyone out there. Truth is, that place looked like it had been empty long enough for the land to forget it ever mattered, with most of the structures giving in to time the same way everything else out there eventually does. But that one building with the red door still standing felt different, like it had held on longer than it should have. And that alone was enough to make us take a closer look. I was halfway up to the porch when I noticed the movement dot. It wasn't much, just a shifting shadow through what used to be a window. But it was enough to make me slow down and glance back at Amy, who had seen it too, and was already watching the building with that sharp, focused look she got when something didn't add up. You see that? I said under my breath. She gave a small nod without taking her eyes off the doorway. Yeah, we're not alone. That should have been enough to turn us around, at least for most folks. But by that point, we had gone through 4 doors and more frustration than either of us cared to admit. And whatever hesitation we felt got outweighed by the need for an answer. So I stepped up onto the porch, the wood creaking under my boots in a way that told me it shouldn't have been holding together as well as it was. And before I could knock or call out, the door shifted inward with a slow, steady sound. The man standing there looked like he had been part of that place longer than the walls themselves. He was older, though it was hard to say how old exactly because the desert has a way of carving years into a person's face without keeping count. And he stood there in a worn shirt and suspenders, his posture straight despite the time that had clearly settled into him, his eyes steady in a way that made it clear he had seen more than he bothered talking about. You've been staring at that door long enough, he said, his voice calm but edged with something that sounded almost like quiet amusement. Figure you might as well come ask about it. Amy and I exchanged a quick glance, and I couldn't help but let out a small breath of a laugh because he wasn't wrong. We've been having trouble with ours, I said, nodding toward the red surface behind him. Can't seem to make one last. He looked at me for a moment, then passed me toward the direction we had come from. Like he already knew exactly what kind of trouble we were talking about. "They rot on you," he said simply. "From the bottom up. Same every time." I felt a slight shift in my chest, hearing him say it that plainly, because that was exactly what had been happening. "Yeah," I replied. "No matter what we do." He stepped out onto the porch then, closing the door behind him with a slow, deliberate motion. And I noticed the way his hand lingered on the red wood for just a second longer than necessary, like it wasn't just something that he used, but something he trusted. "That ain't bad luck," he said, turning back to face us. "That's the land doing what it does." Amy crossed her arms, her curiosity already pulling her in. "What do you mean?" He gestured out across the dry stretch of ground, the wind moving light through the dust as the sun dipped lower behind us. "Looks dead, don't it?" he said. "Dry enough to crack your skin open if you stay out too long. But there's still life in it, just not the kind you see." I frowned slightly, trying to follow where he was going with it. "There's rot in the dust," he continued, his voice steady and matter-of-fact. "Fungi, spores. Things that don't need much water to get into wood and start breaking it down. You give 'em a place to settle, they'll take it, and once they're in, it don't matter how dry the air is, they'll eat it from the inside until there ain't nothing left to hold." Amy leaned forward slightly, her expression sharpening as it started to make sense. "So the oil we've been using, it's not stopping it. It's feeding it some of the time," he said without hesitation. "Oil alone'll seal the wood some, but it also gives those things something to work with if they get in. You've been treating the surface, not killing what's trying to live in it." I'll let that settle for a second, thinking back on every door we had hung and how each one had failed the same way. Slow at first, and then all at once. "So what's different about this one?" I asked, nodding toward the door behind him. He gave a small, knowing look at that, like he had been waiting for the question. "That ain't just paint," he said. "That's iron." Amy tilted her head slightly. "Iron?" "Rust, if you want to call it that," he replied. "Ground down fine and mixed in with linseed oil, worked into the wood until it don't just sit on top, but soaks in deep. The iron stops the growth, keeps those little things from taking hold, and the oil hardens up after, locks it all in place." I stepped closer to the door again, running my fingers along that same smooth surface, and now that he had said it, I could feel the difference in a way I hadn't before, the weight of it, the way it had settled into the grain instead of covering it. "You been using this a long time?" I asked. He let out a quiet breath, glancing out over the land again. "Long enough to stop replacing doors every season," he said. "Learned it from someone older than me, and he learned it from someone before him. Folks out here didn't have the luxury of wasting wood, so they figured out how to make it last." Amy nodded slowly, already putting the pieces together. "Iron oxide," she murmured. "It's stable. Doesn't break down in the sun, and if it's stopping fungal growth—" "That's your answer," the old man said, cutting in gently. "You want your door to last, you give the land something it can't take from you." There was something about the way he said that, so simple and certain, that made it feel less like advice and more like something proven over years of trial and failure. I straightened up, looking from the door to him. "You mind showing us how to make it?" For a moment he didn't answer, just studied us both like he was deciding whether we were worth the time. And then he gave a small nod. "Come around back tomorrow morning," he said. "I'll show you how it's done." And just like that, we had the first real answer we'd found since setting foot on that land. We were there before the sun had fully cleared the horizon the next morning. The air still cool in that brief window the desert gives you before the heat settles in, and the old man was already at work behind the structure, moving slow but steady in a way that made it clear he had done the same thing more times than he could count. He didn't waste time with explanations at first. just motioned for us to come closer and watch, and laid out what he had gathered. A small container of fine reddish powder, dark and earthy, and a tin of oil that carried that familiar sharp smell I recognized from the treatments we had been using. "Starts with this," he said, tapping the powder lightly. "Iron oxide. You can pull it from rusted metal if you've got the patience. Grind it down fine enough until it's almost like dust." Amy crouched beside it, studying the texture between her fingers. "And you'll mix it straight into the oil?" "Not just mix," he replied. "You'll work it until it's thick enough to hold but thin enough to soak. Too heavy, it sits on top and cracks. Too light, it don't do its job." He showed us the consistency, stirring it slow until the oil took on that deep red color we had seen on the door. Darker than I expected, almost like dried blood under the morning light. And then he took a rough board and began working the mixture into it with a cloth, pressing it in firm instead of brushing it lightly across the surface. "You don't paint it," he said, glancing up at us. "You'll feed it into the wood." We spent the better part of that morning learning the process, working the mixture into every surface, making sure it reached into the grain, the edges, the places where moisture and dust might settle, and by the time we were done, my hands were stained red in a way that didn't wash off easily, the color settling into the lines of my skin like it belonged there. By midday, the first board had already started to change, the surface losing that oily sheen and taking on a more solid, sealed look as the oil began to cure under the heat, locking the iron into place just like he had said it would. "Give it time," the old man told us as we stepped back to look at it. "It'll harden up, and once it does, you won't be seeing that rot again any time soon." We thanked him before we left, and though he didn't say much in return, there was a quiet understanding in the way he nodded, like he had seen plenty of folks come through that same realization before us. The ride back felt different, not lighter exactly, but steadier, like we were finally carrying something useful instead of just frustration. And by the time we reached the barn, we didn't waste any time putting what we had learned to use. We built the next door that same afternoon, cut the boards, set 'em firm, and before we hung it, we worked that red mixture into every inch of it the way we had been shown, taking our time to make sure it wasn't just coated but fully absorbed, the color settling deep into the wood until it looked less like something applied and more like something that had always been there. By the time we mounted it, the sun was already dropping low again, casting long shadows across the land, and for a moment we just stood there looking at it, that deep red standing out against the worn gray of the barn like a mark of something new. "You think this'll do it?" I asked, though I already felt like I knew the answer. Amy nodded slowly, her eyes still on the door. "Yeah," she said, "I think it will." Weeks passed, then months. The wind came and went, carrying dust that scraped against the wood the same way it always had, and the heat settled in just as heavy as before. But the door didn't change the way the others had there. Where no dark creeping patches, no softening along the base, no slow signs of something eaten. It from the inside it held, and the longer it held, the more it became clear that what we'd been fighting all that time hadn't been bad luck or poor craftsmanship. It had been a lack of understanding, and once we had that, the land didn't feel quite as impossible as it had before. I remember standing there one evening months later, the sun setting low and the sky stretching wide and clear above us, running my hand across that same red surface and feeling the solid strength of it under my palm, and thinking about how something as simple as rust and oil had made the difference between constant failure and something that could last, till Amy stepped up beside me, leaning lightly against the frame as she looked out across the land we had started to shape into something steady. "It's funny, isn't it?" she said, a small smile in her voice. All that trouble. And the answer was sitting out here the whole time. I nodded, glancing back at the door. At the way it caught the last of the light and held on to it just a little longer than everything else around it. Yeah, I said quietly. Just needed someone to show us where to look. And from that point on, every door we built carried that same deep red. Not because it looked good, but because out there, where the land doesn't give you anything for free, it was the difference between something that faded away and something that stayed.